Hi, this is the third and final lecture on the class on Himalayas that I did at USf OSher at Concordia Village in person. Uh, but for those who could not attend or would like to watch it on YouTube, uh, I'm recording it at home. Okay, and last time we talked about Tibet and the cultural history as well as political history, including focusing on Dalai Lama and the Chinese takeover and the consequences in the surrounding region. Okay, so, and before that, we had talked about the mountains and in general, the Himalayan culture, geology, etc. Okay, and I had separately recorded the two small countries, which is Nepal and I'm sorry, in Bhutan and Sikkim, which hopefully some of you may have a time to uh, view on your own. Okay, if not, I will see if I can include at least some features at the after the end of this class. So let's get started. Nepal is a country wedged between India and China or Tibet for, and north of Sikkim and Bhutan, as we have shown this in multiple views. It's a very diverse the society, almost mimicking mini India, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural, multilingual, and multi-religion. Primary, a major population are called Nevaris, Newari, and and at the same time, there is a strong Buddhist Hindu culture. And the word in Nepal is origin is somewhat difficult to define. It may be reflect the Nevari predominance, or it may have origin in Sanskrit because that means Neva means at the foot of the mountain, a holy land. And there was a Swami or yogi named Nevi, Nevi, and so that may have some relationship with it. And so this history is long-standing, dates back to thousands of years. But the modern Nepal, which you can identify in any atlas, dates back to 1763, which we'll talk about at length as we move on in this talk. Okay, and this is the link that is shown on the slide is a very interesting history slide. And for those of you who want to know more, okay, and now, when we talk about Nepal, the things that people who grew up in the 60s may recall Kathmandu and the hippie culture, okay, with the rise, in in San Francisco, and this was the before the rise of militant Islam in the Middle East, especially Iran and Afghanistan. That actually was an easy journey or a sort of rite of passage for Western, somewhat disillusioned people who were upset with the Vietnam War and wanted to find alternatives to Christianity. And with the rise of the drug culture, they traveled from US by cheap airlines, primarily Icelandic Airlines, and from UK and Northern Europe, or Western Europe rather, by land via Greece and Turkey and Istanbul, and making their way to Tehran and then on to Kabul and then gradually via Peshawar and the Khyber Pass, all the way to India and the uh, former Portuguese colony of Goa, which was an easy and relatively cheap place, and also during summers, hot summers of Goa, moved on to Kathmandu, and the more adventurous souls moved on to Bangkok. So this was a route, and a lot of these people ended up staying there. And in fact, there is a street which I don't remember the local name, but it's still called Freak Street in Kathmandu, and some of the old hippies have managed to stay there and have gotten old. And in fact, this may surprise some of you that there actually was a bus tour that took you from London to Calcutta. And again, just vanished with the rise of militant Islam. Okay, so that's enough about hippie culture. Okay, and that was the major introduction of the West to Kathmandu. Okay, and Nepal. This is the geography of Nepal. Again, there are primarily varieties of three main language groups, Nepali, Gorakhi, and I don't have the other one written out somewhere there somewhere, but overall there are 92 official languages, and the languages, just like Tibet, the Indo-Pacific, as well as Tibeto-Burman origin, and later on the Sanskrit-based languages uh, are predominant as well. So you can see that the people who are of Tibetan or Bhutanese ancestry would speak the Indo-Burmese languages, while those who are more of Hindi bent would speak Nevari and Gurung, which is the Gurkha language, while the Pahari, which is the mountain people range, that is again Sanskrit-based, while the Kirati, again, that is more Tibetan-based. Okay, so this is, so it's a strange mixture of various ethnicities. And there are various, you can see how the predominant language is so-called Pahari, and again, with a combination thereof, Okay, and the terrain is divided into the forested region called the Terai at the bottom, and then the fertile valley in the middle, and then the mountainous regions of the Himalayas up north, which are sparsely populated. Okay, and the history of Nepal goes back to almost 3,000 years, with the Indus Valley civilization, and obviously people were mobile to say the least, and moved all along, you know, the coast of India all the way to Australia. So no surprise that some groups migrated to Nepal and settled there and survived. Okay, all right, and moving on to and now after the formation of the present in Nepal, the geography is divided into various about 50 small principalities or kingdoms united into Nepal under a powerful Napoleonic-like ruler, which we will talk about later on. But now the official Nepal is divided into 5 different provinces. The Gandaki River Valley, which is in the center, which is where Kathmandu is, Karnali River, and the various other provinces which are just numbered and not labeled. Okay, and so this is, so they're based upon the flag of Nepal is rather unique. It includes two is one of the only non-rectangular, two triangular shape with crimson background, blue border, and these are both popular colors in art and decorations. It shows a white moon, okay, emitting 8 rays, okay, again, tying in with the Buddhist tradition, crescent attached below. Swastika is still a big part of their culture, even though it's not depicted here, okay. And the other thing is that Nepal is, home to many of the major 8,000-meter peaks. As you can see the names, you can recognize Dhaulagiri, Annapurna, and not Mount Everest, and next to that, which is lesser known, called Makalu, and the famous Kanchenjunga, which led the British trigonometric survey about the mountain that could be seen from hill stations of Darjeeling. Okay, so these are all the big peaks are around there. So the mountaineering is a big business in Nepal on a religious basis, as well as mountain climbing expeditions, primarily hobby and avocation of the Western climbers. Again, the ethnicity of Nepal is diverse, and it follows more or less the Hindu plus the Burmese and the mountain people ethnicity. Chatri is kind of a word that has its origin from Kshatriya, which are the warrior class of the 4 Varna that was ingrained in the Indo-Aryan Hindu culture. The Brahminas are on the top. The Kshatri or Kshatris were the warrior class, and in between the trader class and the artists are, and then later on, last but not the least, the Shudra or the untouchables. And this is with a small percent of mixture with Magar and Tharu people, who are more of a indigenous mountain people. So again, in this And the predominant culture now is the Gurum or Gurkha, but so you can see, and the population, somebody I had forgotten in the class, but this on this slide I have the facts. The population is around 120 million, okay, and and 80% is Hindu, 10% is Buddhist, and a substantial portion is working abroad, and the remittance from abroad is a big the foundation of the economy. Okay, and the Gurkhas and Sherpas are associated with Nepal, but they're a relatively small number, but they are more not known in the Western culture because of the mountain climbing activities. Okay. Now, interestingly, the lower plain, which is bordering India, is more mountainous, and at the lower mosquitoes breed in the very wet climate. But genetically, the Nepalese people, the Tharo, which were the original inhabitants of that area, have uh, developed genetic modification, which gives them a resistance, limited resistance to malaria. And this is somewhat akin to the sickle cell culture in the African American population, and in the thalassemia, which is a deformity of the hemoglobin protein molecule. This gives them resistance to malaria to some extent. Okay, and that's why they were able to survive. And this was again the big reason why the Westerners were not able to travel or settle there. And when they got malaria, they became quite sick, and there was a high incidence of fatality. So mutations of different types have evolved in different populations just to fight against varieties of endemic diseases. Okay, enough about that, but this is not a genetic class. And modern Nepal, as we mentioned, it was a big part of the trade route from the subcontinent to China and Mongolia and Central Asia. And again, and this was created by a ruler named Prithvi Narayan Shah, which I'll have a slide in his statue. Obviously, they didn't have photographs. He was a ruler of a small principality of Gorkhas. He united the country from a number of independent hill states, and this was called the Gorkha. And Gorkha soldiers are known world over for their fighting abilities. And he was again in those days, obviously, a lot of kings were gave the uh, a rule to their firstborn child. And sometimes if the prince is of small underage, and then prime minister or regents would control. So, and obviously, if they manage the uh, kingdom for a number of years, they develop lust for powers and decided to take over. And that's exactly what had happened in Nepal for several years, that the monarchy was there, but they became like a symbol and did not actually have power. So the kings were almost became palace prisoners, and finally, obviously, when they became of age, they decided to exert true powers, and at least even in 20th century, the one of the more progressive King Tribhuvan, ended up running away on with the ruse of hunting to India, and decided to, exert true power. And then so that again got embroiled in various factions who were agitating, were uh, asking for a democratic rule. So it's a very complex story, almost similar to the British royalties. Okay. Now, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Nepal has, as I mentioned a little while ago, has a long history going back to almost 1500 BC or current era, so almost 3,000 plus years. And this can be traced, and there was no written records, but verbal records showed that they were ruled by a dynasty called Gopalas. And Gopala means in Sanskrit means cow herders, and so they can be their linkage can be traced back to the Indian epics of Mahabharata, okay, dating back from the subcontinent, especially from the coast of Arabian Sea. In fact, in recent past, a submerged city called Dwarka, Dwarka, has been discovered. This was initially uh, without any evidence, was thought to be a figment of imagination because it figures widely in the Mahabharata, and which is the birthplace of the one of the god kings, Krishna, and who becomes the charioteer of the princes and of the battle that took place in the plains of Delhi, called and the epic of Mahabharata that every Indian child would be familiar with. Okay, but so that this is followed by other dynasties, Mahipalas, who were the buffalo herders, uh, and followed by the Kirats, who are the mountain people. And that brings us somewhere around Lichwis. Now, the Lichwis are figured importantly because the Gautam Buddha, who the founder of Buddhist religion, was born actually was a Lichwi prince. And at that time, the borders were bordering the modern India, and there was no Nepal at that time. So Buddha was born as a Lichwi prince in modern day Nepal. Okay, so the place, and this was followed by some of the Rajput kings called Malla dynasty. Now, these people were from the plains and the deserts of Rajasthan, India, and with the arrival of militant Islam, they decided to move further north and established various kingdoms, including that. Now, a lot of these can be traced down through various Nepalese literature, in which it is written that the famous temple in Kathmandu called Pashupatinath has been built by the Malla dynasty and was rebuilt by Malla dynasty, I should correct. And before that, it existed in the other uh, Lichwi dynasty and even in the Karat era. So it has been built and rebuilt many times. So it dates back to almost 1500 BC. Okay. And obviously, if it was rebuilt, that means there was something there beforehand. Okay. And so this ties in very nicely with the religious beliefs of the uh, uh, long-term inhabitants of Nepal. And now, the Nepal has the advantage or disadvantage to be wedged between two powerful, big countries, China and India. And subsequently, when India came under British control, again, they had to uh, uh, please both the sides and manage to survive. Okay, so and again, when you look at the palace intrigues, they're about as complicated as those of the British dynasty, and you can see that as we see the House of Tudors and Stuarts, in the same way, there are various dynasties that they can have a series of kings that they have been memorized on and well remembered in the Nepal history. And again, the history is quite complicated with murders, multiple wives, and the struggle as to whose son will be the king. So it's an extremely complicated history, which, unless you're a real true history scholar, is not germane to our class, and we don't have the time to get too much into it. I will focus on the more principal characters in this. Okay, and so again, we've already talked about these, and so the real kingdom dates back to 1760, and we already talked about the mosquitoes, and now and, and finally now one can put the finish on it that the uh, monarchy has been finally dissolved in 2008, and Nepal is now a federal republic. Okay, and in between they went through a lot of political upheaval. Okay, as to democracy on and off, rule for the small village type control, and with the rise of communist China, with the Maoist insurgency, and and even a murder in the palace. Now, digressing a little bit into the religious aspect, Nepal follows the Hindu tradition, so they have hundreds of gods. Some people are followers of Shiva, some people are followers of Vishnu, and huge number are Buddhist, and the religious beliefs are a big mixture. So they have a lot of festivals, and the Nepali or Hindi word would be called jatra, means pilgrimage. Okay, and somewhere along the line, a lot of these mythologies and gods can find a parallel in the Roman and Greek or Norse mythology as well. That Lord Indra is well recognized in the German uh, belief system before Christianity, as well as in Hindu and Nepalese culture. So this is part of the Indra Jatra, means pilgrimage, and this again follows on the tails of the festival of rain. Okay, and there is something called the Kamari, that the gods are not just a monopoly of males, but even female deities are worshipped. Kali, which is the tantric goddess from Bengal, which is worshipped. At the same time, a small pre-pubertal girl is selected and worshipped as a reincarnation, okay, and is decorated with flowers and gold and jewelry, and celebrated as to getting their blessings or blessings. And so there are varieties of belief system, and the various chariot festivals continues in Kathmandu for almost 3 days. Okay, and it's considered representative of various gods, as sort of not quite a reincarnation, but close to it. Interestingly, the cultural influence extended from the plains of Nepal and Hindu to all the way to the court of the great Kublai Khan in 1200 current era. Okay, when Kublai Khan wanted to build a stupa or a monument, okay, to his Buddhist belief in what is modern day Beijing, okay, and he was familiar with the skills and prestige of the Nebari architects and designers. So he invited a number of people, and a young 17-year-old architect named Araniko, who was obviously talented beyond his young age, led a group of about 50 artists and stayed for several decades in Nepal and built various buildings and religious places, along with the famous white stupa. And so this was a mission that was sent to, the Chinese court. Okay, and this was traveled by a Western traveler named Samuel Purchas, who did the pilgrimage in early 1600, and with the first arrival of the British ships in uh, central India from via Arabia, via the Cape of Good Hope. And so this story, and he went on and wrote travelogue, the Samuel Purchas, and this was read by the great poet uh, Samuel Coleridge. And Samuel Coleridge, in the Romantic era, was quite indulgent in hashish and opium. And during one of his drug-addled uh, journeys or trips, okay, he wrote the famous poem Xanadu of Kubla Khan, okay, and there he describes a stately pressure dome decreed, near the sacred river, ran through currents and caverns measureless to man down to the sunless sea. Okay, so this is a famous poem. So it was influenced obviously by the travel log that he was aware of, in a few hundred years before. Okay, now as always, the Jesuits were the first one to explore. They were the first Westerners to explore this area. The two names that need to be mentioned are, Johannes Gruber, obviously a German uh, clergyman. He traveled through, in the 17th century to India, Tibet, and Nepal. Okay, followed by another person named Heinrich Roth, Okay, and he was a Sanskrit scholar, and they wrote varieties of books on the China travels, and eventually traveled back to Rome via Kabul. Okay, one of them I think died in India due to fevers or something. Now, Heinrich Roth wanted to publish a Sanskrit grammar into Latin, but this was considered no-no by the church superior, so it took another couple of 100 or so years before it eventually was published. And at the same time, there are other equally talented uh, travelers. The one that needs to be mentioned was a gentleman named Athenius Kircher. He was a polymath par excellence, not just a religious scholar, but a geologist, a physician, and can be quietly said as a last Renaissance man. And obviously, some of his ideas about continent formation was totally wrong, but he was the predecessors of Descartes. Okay, and before the Enlightenment era, so he's deserves to be mentioned. Along with that, there were other travelers named a Frenchman named Francois Bernier was in the Mughal Empire as well and wrote various scholarly travelogues. So the cultural exchange with even in those times when the travel was hard was very much a fact of life. Okay, and now when focusing upon Nepal again, we need to recognize the genius and the scholarliness of the Britishers who went at a very young age and not only administered and were involved in trade and went in with the idea to get rich, obviously, but their passion was with other disciplines, including botany, ornithology, languages. So one that deserves to be mentioned was Brian Houghton Hodgson, who was born in 1801, again from a large family. And as a lot of time it happens, his father's business was failing. So to make fortune, went to East India Company College and started out as a lowly clerk, and with the influence his of the directors in those days. Again, obviously, they who you knew was great important, so that's how he found the job in the early days of British India. And again, being a not European, the health of the tropics was very hard on him, and he would have returned home, but fortunately for him, again through the influences of his uh, family in Britain, was able to secure transfers to a Kumaon region, what we talked about in the northwest Himalayas, and later on acquired the position in modern-day Nepal after the British administration was allowed to place a resident or our man in Kathmandu. So, and his job was relatively small and straightforward. He was confined to a relatively narrow area because the Nepalese kings were very suspicious of Christians and foreigners. And even though they were allowing them trade, they did not want their uh, to have missionaries follow on their tag. So Brian Hodgson, studied the flora and fauna of that region, wrote varieties of scholarly papers that were accepted by the Geographic Society and the Royal Society, and at the same time, studied the local population. And he was the first one to know that the local Gurkhas were uh, good fighters, and it would be wise to recruit them in the East India Company so-called paid army, because at that time the army was comprised mostly of Brahmins and farmers from the Bengal region, that was under the control of the East India Company. But his recommendations fell on deaf ears. So instead of being recruited uh, in the early 19th century, it had to wait until for another 30, 40 years before the Gurkhas became part of the East India Company and subsequently the British Army. Because again, the natives were looked down upon. The East India Company favored hiring Europeans, but it was a numbers game. The lower rank went to the natives, and obviously the more gunners and other things went to the European mercenaries who made their way into the subcontinent after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Okay, so again, and uh, and it may not be surprised that the Europeans stayed united, and a lot of time, even when they were employed by the Indian princes, when it came to fighting against the uh, uh, white races, they switched sides. And again, so and and at that time, the European warring technology was far superior to the Mughal and Nepalis, and leading rise to their eventual defeat. And obviously they were better at money management. So, and uh, and interestingly, in the East, it turns out that those who pay the write the monthly check, those were that deserve the loyalty. And obviously, the local people have been under control of various small petty kingdoms, and then eventually, subsequently, the Muslim and the Mughals and the Marathas. So obviously, they did not care as to who controlled the country as long as they received a regular paycheck. And the East India Company, with their profitable trades, were able to issue regular payments, and in turn were able to recruit a huge number of sepoys. Okay. So, and now, eventually, Brian Hudson's talents and his scholarliness was recognized, and in the headquarters of the East India Company buildings in Calcutta, which was the capital of British India, here is his bust, and it surprises that it is styled in the style of a Roman no, senator. So he's wearing a toga and with a different hairstyle, obviously this is not exactly. And this again, the roots of this bust, because by this time the Britishers had considered themselves as inheritors or keepers of the Greek-Roman learning tradition and scholarliness, and that perhaps and to continue the so-called Aryan culture. This was the early rise of genetics, okay, with the rise of Malthus. And in fact, Malthus, the one who uh, proposed the Malthus doctrine of overpopulation and resources, was one of the teachers of Brian Hodgson. Okay, so how it ties in. And obviously, this with the rise of, later on, rise of Darwinism and Galton, the genetics and the racial superiority theories and the Indo-European languages, came into prominence. So they were strictly influenced, and their mission was considered as to make the the natives of the subcontinent more Christian and become more enlightened. So they considered themselves as a mission. So now, getting back to Brian Hodgson, he was as his as with the longer and longer stay, he became heavily involved in the Nepal politics, and was really a kingmaker, so-called Kissinger or Machiavelli of his time. And he favored, but became friendly with a lot of the prime ministers and the kings themselves, and was instrumental in supporting the people who looked after the East India Company interest. So kind of a wheeler dealer maker. And after he retired from that area, he came back to England and again make a second trip and settled as a nice country gentleman in Darjeeling, which is on the foothills of Himalayas and the eastern part as a hill station. And again, continued his scholarly pursuits. And at that time, the intellectual context was very prevalent. A well-known botanist who was in correspondence with Charles Darwin named Joseph Hooker, traveled and corresponded with Brian Horton and studied botany and the native plant structures. And some of these plants were sent to the Kew Gardens under the auspices of the great Joseph Banks, who was the founder of the Royal Society and remained the president for a number of years during the Darwin era, and Humphrey Davy and other things. And some of you may recall that I did a class on the history of the Royal Society. And not to mention, Joseph Hooker traveled as a botanist and a physician with Ross, who went for the northwestern passages on the infamous, well-known ship Erebus. Okay, obviously, the first trip was successful, so he came back. But during the second journey for the Northwest Passages, the Erebus ship, sank and was lost, and was rediscovered, after several decades. Okay, so this is what he actually looked like. So, but so this the contrast was worth mentioning, and was amusing. Now, the Indology was not just a monopoly of the Brits. Okay, there were other scholars, including one that I didn't mention when we talked about named the guy named Tutsi, who was an Italian scholar who was a Tibet expert of repute. Another one that needs to be mentioned is Sylvan Levy. Okay, obviously he was of a Jewish ancestry, but he may have converted to Lutheranism, but that's not important. But he was a Sanskrit scholar, Indologist, and did a very scholarly study of the history of Nepal. Okay, and then so these are some of his reference links about his. And then again, he was anti-racial science, and this is, you can just see his scholarly works, a literary history, okay, of Sanskrit Buddhism, and he had traveled extensively in that region and had done, okay, and he was a keen observer on the history of Nepal. He clearly mentioned, and as to, he was living even in the 20th century, and you can just see it, some of these photographs, that were there for Indra Yatra, okay, that, has been documented. He also documented on the Buddhism and the Lichwi caves, okay, and and the varieties of other tradition following Shiva was well documented. And he describes that Kathmandu is almost like what India would have been 1,000 years ago, okay, and so there's three different cultures coexisted: Hinduism, Buddhism, Tantric philosophy, okay, which is, indulging in, drinking alcohol and trying to enlighten your brain with drugs, was equal part of it. Okay, and then again, he describes on various forms of dressing of Nepal culture, and he clearly describes that the Nepalese women did not dress differently, but were subsequently influenced by the Islamic culture. And so again, so he's the person who is, really made very scholarly studies of the Nepal region. Okay, now again, I kept mentioning earlier that the founder of Nepal was a small ruler of a small princely uh, estate or kingdom or state, okay, or a petty state, Prithvi Narayan Shah. But he was a leader, warrior of par excellence, and he united the Gorkha tribes and decided to take on the Kathmandu Valley and other kingdoms called Kirtipur, okay, and some after ups and downs, managed to unite about 50 states. And along with that, obviously, suffered setbacks, but persisted and eventually formed a modern day Nepal. And his dynasty lasted for a relatively few years, but again, he's established, the Shah dynasty, which continued for almost 200 years. Unfortunately, with the idea of giving the succession be to the firstborn child, that backfired on them. So in turns, when the child was young, they ended to rely on the on the queen, and at the same time the various ministers, and the ministers became a force to be reckoned with. And his son Prithvinarayan Shah was a son named Rajendra. He was only 2 years old, and they ended up relying on the prime minister named Thampa, and who was an able administrator and literally took over and claimed the uh, king under his thumb. And that tradition again, came to be real, a sort of parallel resurgence. So it was an absolute monarchy, was controlled by the powerful prime ministers. Okay, so it created, and some of them were good rulers, but at the same time, some of them were very tyrant as well. Now, some of the kings, obviously, I can't go through all the dynasty that went around and uh, the killings and the machinations of the royal house. But some of the kings that deserve to be mentioned, King Tribhuwana, who was a progressive king, okay, and followed by King Mahendra and Birendra. And finally, with the when they tried to democratize this, there was some of the family quarrels backfired, leading to the assassination by one of his own sons, Dipendra, in 2001. Okay, so it's a very complicated story, almost makes for a soap opera or drama to some extent. Okay, now again, the Nepalis were ambitious people. Once they united Nepal from the Kumaon region all the way to the eastern part, they absorbed some territory from Sikkim, and they became more ambitious and got into wars with Tibet. And the cause for that was economic, because Tibet did not have mint. So the Nepali uh, printed silver coins for Tibet. And unfortunately, they were running out of the pure silver. So they started using alloys, which did not go well with the Tibetan lamas. And that led to the first uh, war, and the Nepalis came out on top. And subsequently, that they again some other reasons, that the government of Nepal will pay compensation were looted, and again, so they got a favorable agreement. During the second time, when the aggression took place for some again, minuscule reasons, you know and at that time, Tibet was obviously a tributary uh, state to the Chinese emperor. And the Chinese emperor, when he finally heard about this, he decided to send about 20,000 soldiers, and the Nepalis ended up being on the losing side. And again, so they agreed, they were not taken over completely by the Qing dynasty, but Nepal again in turn became a tributary state to the Chinese emperors. Okay, and again, the China, at least on paper, agreed that they will help them defend against any external aggression. And again, but by that time, they were becoming splinter force, and leading to the rise of the British control, indirect control over Nepal. Again, so that again, being between two giant countries, did not work out too well for them in the end. Now, this led to when the Nepalis had taken over part of the Sikkim area and were not willing to allow trade passages, said then again, and at the same time, the British wanted to establish trade routes to China. That led to the expansionist policy of the East India Company. So they were right in the middle of it, and then they decided to, attack the Nepal Valley. Obviously, and there were like two or three different attempts of war that took place, and this is when the East India Company found out that just being out, having a larger army and better weaponry does not always work. And during the first of the three attacks on Nepal, they came out on the short end and suffered substantial number of casualties. Okay, and during the second one, even though they were outnumbered, the Nepalis managed to hold their own. Okay, and finally, when even though uh, their water supply was cut off, and they managed to repel the British attacks. Finally, the British East India Company decided to take bigger guns, and were successful. Okay, and afterwards, when they were outgunned, so now during this, they came to recognize that this was the era where the Britishers were, a lot of them were public school educated, and they enjoyed, the manly fighters, again similar to what they discovered in, even though they won, they appreciated the enemy. And the both sides came to realize that these people were good fighters, and at the same time were treated the losing side more humanely, because even after the Gurkhas lost the battle, the British American people treated the Gurkhas, allowed them some first aid, and were released. They were not made slaves. So both sides developed healthy respect, and this was, the monument that was erected, in the area for the Nepalese bravery. Okay, so both sides recognized that they were good fighters. Okay, and this is, again, you can just see that varieties of the monuments and plaques have been about the uh, about the fighter. The name is misspelled. Bulbhandra. He was a Nepalese, a gallant adversary commander, fought with brave Gurkhas who were afterwards as well in the service of Ranjit Singh. So they were fought to the last man. This is during the Afghan war. So they're being recognized as their valor and courage. Were well respected by the British Army officers. Okay. Now the man who finally put the Nepal won the Nepalese war was an interesting character. His name happens to be David Ochterlony, and born in 758 in the colonies of America, and his mother was from Boston, and eventually, after her husband died, married somebody else who was a Britisher in West Indies, and ended up moving to England. And so David Ochterlony, even though he was born in Boston, he ended up going to school in Britain, and found a fortune in the East India Company, and went in as a ordinary soldier, and subsequently fought in various wars in the subcontinent, and was a good leader, and fought during the Maratha wars, the Mughal wars, and finally was the last one to lead you know, the last attack on Nepal. And obviously, in those days, they did not go with their whole family. Okay, but David Ochterlony adopted the local custom, and here you can see him in this painting, dressed in the Mughal style, enjoying dance uh, with the uh, Islamic culture. And here he's smoking hookah. And he also married an Islamic woman, and had were traveled on varieties of, obviously polygamy was very common, and traveled with his bibis, on elephants. Now, moving on to the prime ministers that the Nepalis selected, were the one who figured large was a guy named Jung Bahadur Rana, and he was one of the first ones who united Nepal, and realized that being on the good side of Britain was a favorable decision. So again, he engineered varieties of coups, and literally kept the kings under his thumb, and was a de facto ruler. And he was quite a tyrant, assassinated a lot of people who opposed him. Okay, and when he conquered people, he obviously uh, recruited them in slavery, and punished them, heavily, and at the same time, used the revenue of the state for his personal luxuries, and again, learned the English language, and obviously, was quite friendly with the British agents who were placed. And he requested that he wanted to travel to Britain, and obviously, being a prince, and de facto ruler of the principality, he was given permission, and traveled by ship to Victorian Britain, and went in with, obviously, jewels and huge sums of money, and obviously, was an exotic traveler, and both sides were duly impressed. Jung Bahadur Rana, his eyes were opened with the modernness of Victorian Britain, and the rule of law that was there, and lack of slavery, and so he realized that his kingdom was quite backwards. So, and at the same time, the exoticness of an Indian prince was eye opener to the Victorian Brits. And again, it was a strange mixture that on one hand he wanted to milk the cows that he took with him and was a pure Hindu, uh, okay, but at the same time, would participate in visiting opera and various museums and culture. Eventually, on his way back, he traveled through Paris and Egypt and met varieties of royalties, okay, and at the same time was not above indulging in was had a roving eye for women. The one that needs to be mentioned was varieties of so-called prostitute or women of low moral, as it was called in the Victorian era, were trying to seek favors, and he obviously was generous with giving gifts and jewels and diamonds. So it was a strange trip, to put it mildly. And he also actually was interested in visiting and meeting a self-styled Irish woman whose name was Emily something, who had traveled to Simla and later on had styled herself as an exotic dancer and had affairs with the King Prince of Bavaria. Okay, so again, so this so it was an interesting mixture of sex in the Puritan Britain and Europe. And he was followed by another equally powerful prime minister or uh, named Chandra Shamshar, who eventually abolished slavery in Japan, in Nepal, and established Western style education and instituted various religious reforms, including abolition of sati, which is where women would throw themselves on the funeral pyre after the death of their uh, uh, husband. Okay. And subsequently, in the early 20th century, when the Nepalese kings established democracy, the way in India, the Nehru family is prominent for several decades and several almost 150 years. In Nepal, the biggest name is Koirala, and with the rise of democracy, these were Western educated, primarily in India and some in Britain. Four prime ministers are from Koirala family, and a lot of them followed the Indian independence movement and established the Nepali Congress and asked for people's rule. And obviously, it did not go well with the monarchy and the autocratic prime ministers, and a lot of them spent several years in jail. Okay, and here and after the democracy was established and they became prime ministers, and they were recognized. And for some reason, Israel was quite friendly with Nepal. I haven't looked into the reason, but here is the Nepalese Prime Minister Girja Prasad with none other than Ben Gurion in 1959, and he was his ambassador at United Nations. So again, so they carried more weight for the small kingdom. Okay, and obviously with the rise of communist China, they had to reckon with the rise of communism. For the poor population, communism became popular. Okay. And last but not the least, the Koirala family has varieties of businessmen, leaders, lawyers, and one of their granddaughters had made into Bollywood, and here she is, Manisha Koirala, and she's almost in her 50s or 60s now, and she's a well-known actress in Bollywood. Okay, and so I'm sorry, this is a repeat slide, of Brian Houghton. We already talked at length about it. My apologies, sorry. Okay, so he was a big Nepal hand that we talked about, and he had written as many as 140 zoological papers. And now, after the Nepal was became accepted the British superiority and accepted came under British protection, a lot of the soldiers who were left, that finally East India Company and they would Dr. Loney decided to recruit these people as they were good martial race fighters, and and again, that was a stroke of genius because during the Indian mutiny or War of Independence, whatever words you want to use, in 1857. They fought on the British side and fought in the siege of Delhi, against the Muslim rebellion. Okay, and during the Sikhs wars also, and not only that, they have the huge contingent was part of the British Army, British Indian Army. Okay, and served loyally all over wherever the British Empire was. Okay, and this is their, and they recognize their brilliance. Okay, here you can see, the statue of Gurkha in Westminster. Okay, and these are the king, as I mentioned. I'll only mention the important kings, and King Tribhuvan, who first started democracy in Nepal, and subsequently with the fight up with the prime minister, he had to leave his country and seek for asylum in Nehru, under Nehru in India, and subsequently he was allowed to return back, and followed afterwards his son King Mahendra took over, and again, this was the second person in with the red dress. Okay, and followed by King Birendra, who's I don't have his picture here, and last but the most current king is King Gyanendra, okay, who is finally agreed to dissolve the monarchy, okay, and after various struggles, but trying to appease both the democratically elected parties as well as trying to suppress the communist insurgency, because the communists were obviously big agitators and they had military support from Nepal. But the King Nyanendra, and they did not want to use the Nepalese military against their own people, so that allowed the fighting to continue for several years. Okay, and led to the eventual. And this just turns out to the fable that it goes back to the era of Prithviraj, the founder, that some sage had predicted that his kingdom will last for 10 generations, and lo and behold, that's about the time when finally monarchy was abolished. So the myths found some truth. Okay, and now here's the words or two about the Gurkha kingdom, that for king and a faraway country. So they fought not just for their own king, but for the queen and the King Edward and King George. So from 1815 onwards, they fought all over the world. Okay, they were loyal. As many as 200,000 people fought in the First World War, or the British on the Allied side. Similarly, in Second World War, they were still, until 1999, there was a Gurkha battalion in Hong Kong, and still, even now, there is a British Army has a huge recruiting drive for Gurkha, and that's considered a prized position, and because they are very loyal fighters, and the pay is much better. So obviously, in a poor country, being a soldier is, as your family is set for life. And here they are, the picture you can see they're undergoing vigorous physical testing, so before for the recruitment. Okay, and and that the formal marches and the uniforms, the red marching brigade. And there is a quote that by one of the Indian field marshal: if a man says he's not afraid of dying, he's either lying or he's a Gurkha. So again, so their bravery and fighting till finish, at the cost, not worrying about dying, is well recognized all over the world. So they fought not just in India, but also in Burma, Afghanistan, Cyprus, Malaya, China, Tibet, okay, all over the world, in Middle East and in France. So they've been all over the. Now again, Nepal has not just mountain climbing, but trekking is a big business. And one personal story is worth mentioning, that a medical student from Australia was traveling in fall with his partner, with his friend, and they got lost during bad weather, and they became separated. And James Scott ended up in the mountainous area with absolutely no visibility, and ended up hiding in a cave, and was considered would have died, but managed to survive on his own with just ice water and starvation and with minimal supplies for about 43 days, and was finally discovered by the Nepalese uh, search mission. And it turns out that his sister had gone to finance and to help with the search, and had out of desperation had consulted a lama, and the lama had advised the sister, the Nepalese army is searching in the wrong place. And finally, with her insistence, they started searching in the area that the lama had pointed out, and lo and behold, you know, uh, James was found, obviously in a very poor physical condition after 43 days. So it's a record for trekking. And this makes a very interesting story about, and here he is as a physician 20 years later being interviewed by one of the British channels. And another person with a similar name, James Owens Roberts, is the Gurkha Regiment officer and is called the father of trekking and mountaineer in Nepal. He went there, with the British Army, and managed to find a career out of it. And he's considered, the starting of the trekking industry that started in Nepal in the 1970s. Okay, I think I'm going to pause for a minute and. Okay, so I think we've talked enough about Nepal at this stage. Okay, and now I'm sorry, no, I had a couple of more things. That interesting how the royalty looks out for each other. Here is the famous visit of Queen Elizabeth, when she was a young queen traveling to Nepal in 1960. Okay, so and we can see that here the entourage is traveling on elephant with tiger hunting. Okay, followed by somewhere along the line there is her Okay, so now this was again on the tail of that. In 1959, democracy was overthrown by King Mahendra, but that did not bother the Her Majesty, and subsequently, so democracy was uh, restored in a minimal fashion in 72 by King Mahendra. Okay, but again the agitation continued. So several years. It's a very bloodied history that comes around. So, but the contrast was surprising that the Western democracy had and Her Majesty the Queen did not have any reservations about traveling through semi-dictatorship autocratic kingdom of Nepal and going on a hunting expedition for the Commonwealth. Okay. Now another Elizabeth who deserves to be mentioned is a young woman who went as a reporter for one of the New York newspapers based in Kathmandu, and became a reporter for that part of the world. Okay, and was reporting on the Nepal politics and mountaineering, and eventually afterwards, when she went back, she decided to make that as her home. Okay, and became sort of the grandmother of the mountaineering expeditions, and Western travelers kept meticulous records of the successful mountaineering, and every mountaineer visited her and obtained her advice and input. Okay, and at the same time, she was quite supportive of the prime ministers, who were more democratic, and wrote, well, and reported firsthand on site in the Western newspapers. Elizabeth Hawley. So, and she verifies the record of she's the chronicler of the mountain words, so to speak, and she maintains a very meticulous database of the successful climbs of various peaks in that region. Okay, and now here, this is a interesting clip that I may have sent that to you with the bonus recording, but for the varieties of sites of Kathmandu. Okay, let's see, let's hope it plays.
I think I'm going to Kathmandu. That's really, really where I'm going to. If I ever get out of here, that's where I'm gonna do.
Okay, these are the various temples of Kathmandu, and you can see the architecture is exquisite. Let me go back. For those of you who are the rock and roll fan, may recognize that the song Kathmandu by Bob Seger. Okay, and now I'll try to see if I can show some of these. These are the famous Darbar Square in Kathmandu, the stone architecture of the lions in Darbar Square, which is in Kathmandu, as well as the Patan, the other state. Okay, and then moving on to, okay, you can see again part of the Darbar Square temples and buildings. Okay, again, these are the wooden buildings. Okay, some of these were damaged in after the earthquake, but are being restored. Okay, and this is the famous Bodhinath Stupa. Okay, you can see that this Swayambhu Stupa from the distance. It's covered with gold and various architectures. And again, so more images. This is the painted eyes. This is one of the famous sites in temples in Kathmandu. And this temple, in the Swayambhu temple, monkeys are allowed free roaming sites. And this is the famous big Buddha statues in the Buddha Park. And this is again part of the Kathmandu architectures. This is the famous Pashupatinath temple, which has been built and rebuilt for more than 1500 years. And this is the holy place that during the Bhagirathi River, there is open cremation. You can just see that, funeral pyres. Okay. Yeah, I think that was the last one on this one. So, okay, so let's move on. So that just gives you an idea of the various, and it's obvious it's a bustling city with modern Pizza Huts and discos along with the old temples. Okay, now this is some mountaineering, and this is one of the videos that I found for 1922, the first expedition that was done by British Mountaineering Club, Himalayan Mountaineering Club, that was formed on the similar style after the Alpine Climbing Cup, and so it's a nice video for. They took cine cameras, which weighed almost like 30 or 40 pounds, okay, up the mountains during the expedition, and people from the base camp actually photographed, and it's a black and white film, but it's really it's amazing technological documentation. Okay, I don't know if this will pay. Yeah, okay, I took some slides from it because it was, I think I was not able to download the whole this thing, but here's a link for those. The four people who were selected was the leader was Major Bruce, but he was older, so he did not climb himself. Okay, but the four people from left to right are Major Moorhead, and who eventually suffered frostbite on his way down, and the second one is George Mallory, who is kind of the who is who of the early Everest expeditions. The third one is a medical man named Somerville, and the last one is a Major Norton, who was an artillery officer. Okay, so these were a bunch of amateurs, but at the same time they were highly skilled mountaineers, and they were not doing it for the sport of it. They were not trying to monetize it. And this has been a dramatic shift, from the amateur and sports climber to commercializing business that's opened up in 1990s. Okay, and so this is now it took almost 30 years finally to conquer Everest, and I showed this picture earlier of Hillary and Tenzing in 1953. So a variety of expeditions were carried out, and obviously it was a British monopoly. They did not that the Nepalese government and the Tibetan governments did not give too easy permits. Okay, some attempts were made by the Russians from the other side, but and the Germans, but they were not too successful. And now clicking on to I think more we have, this was a well publicized bestseller book by the Commercial Ventures, by a reporter for the Outside magazine named Scott John Krakauer, Into Thin Air, that is about the expedition, which ended up disastrously. But the two commercial mountain climbers who recruited clients and were in competition with each other. Rob Hall from New Zealand and Scott Fisher, American, and the expedition, ran into bad weather, and 8 people died during the descent from the mountains. And so this was John Krakauer, who had originally gone as a reporter and was not planning to climb, but did summit and wrote the very expose or critique of the expedition and the mismanagement that was carried out. And now there's some controversy about the book about the very experienced Kazakhstan climber as to whether he actually descended on his own and leaving his clients to suffer or die, okay, or whether he actually went back to rescue them. So, but there are some varieties of various schools of thought that have been proposed as to what but it was a very good writing about the commercialization of Everest with fatality. Now the timeline is extensive. The first expedition were carried out in this region where Francis Young husband we talked about opening of Tibet and the Shangri-La, and followed by the mountaineering that we mentioned a little while ago. And the first attempt was done by Mallory, who went to as high as 23,000 feet, and he disappeared in 1924 in the second expedition. And there was still became the big mystery of the empire. I'll have some slides for that as we follow along. And finally, reconnaissance was done by Tenzing Norway as early as 1935, finally achieving success in 53 because the Second World War interrupted, the efforts in those times, and followed by, now all the floodgates have opened up that since that time, as many as 6,000 or almost nearly 7,000 people have summited Mount Everest, and a lot of them are multiple climbers, especially the Sherpas and some Westerners as well. But you can see that all the countries have been represented, starting from obviously the Nepalis, are a large number. So are the Americans and the Indians, the countries with larger populations, and UK was the first one to start the sport, as you can see. But almost everybody is represented, including Taiwanese, and finally the first time the attempt was made successfully to climb without oxygen, and so it's a very multinational effort. Now this is in. Let me see if I can show this in more details if I can. Okay. Okay, there are two routes primarily: the one through Tibet and Nepal, and at the same time the other is from Tibet. Okay, and this is starting out. I'll have some better route. So the varieties are routes that are marked out. The Lhotse face, the Western Kum, and the Combo Ice Fall. So this is gives you the idea as to how the varieties of routes. But this I have better maps that are coming up. I think so. Okay, this just gives you different routes have been selected by the different climbers. You can see that this legend is just gives you. So this is okay. Now the better maps are coming up here. That this is the base camp is as high as 19,000 feet. Again, that is high enough to cause mountain sickness for the inexperienced. So people stay there for almost 10 days for adapting to the thin air. Okay, but even then, so it gets a very crowded place. And then gradually they would make an attempt to Camp 2, okay, which is at 21,000 feet, as you can see. And then further on, going up from base camp, that goes up to an area, treacherous area called Combo Ice Fall, which is part of the glacier. I'll have some slides about that as we move along. Okay, and then further on, this is the more detailed route. You can see that this is the base camp onwards, camp first onwards, and this is the long path. Okay, let's see if I can zoom in on that area. Okay, the Western Kum. This is a Welsh word, CWM, it's pronounced Kum, the West Ridge route, and this is this Camp 2. Okay, let me escape that. And moving on to Camp 3, which is at 23,000 square feet, and then it's called Col. The Col is actually a lowest point between two peaks, and then there is the area called the ridge of the mountain, which is labeled by mountaineers as called balcony. Okay, and then further on, from onwards, let's see if I can zoom in on that area. South Col in the balcony, we talked about the south summit, and that is a steep cliff which was labeled as a Hillary step. Okay, and then eventually the dash to the summit. So after somewhere along the line there's the Camp 4, which there's no show. So it's a very gradual and process. Okay, now I think hopefully this will play. This is a much better video of the 3D video map. Okay, let's let it. So hopefully you can see this is an amazingly impressive video type. Okay, and again, just to summarize the way to the summit, it's called the Western Comb, which is, one of the points. And there are varieties names that have been labeled by the mountaineers, but those are only for the real aficionados. Okay, and so it's a mixture of cliffs, valleys, ice, and some of these areas are sheer blue ice, which are at 40 to 80 degree pitches, and it requires fixing ropes, which is done by the Sherpas. And so, and the people who are the mountain climbers follow what has been laid out, and it requires varieties of ladders. Okay, and so this, requires a huge amount of team effort, to put it mildly. Okay, and obviously the names were selected by the Western mountaineers. So okay, and this is the famous Hillary step, which is right before the summit, and you can just see how it's a steep incline of rock which requires ladder. So okay, and now this may have been damaged during 2015 earthquake, but this still, just for the historical and the prestige thing, Nepal still wants to keep the name. This is at as high as 28,750 feet, so it's a big 40-foot spur of snow and ice there. Okay, and again, it's officially gone. This is the expose research of the outside magazine, that it may have been damaged, okay, and it's been fundamentally altered by the earthquake, that shook the mountain. And again, you can see the climbers up on the route. Okay, now again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a risky business, to put it, mildly. Okay, and you can see that there is a 1 out of 10 chance of not making it. So these were summits and deaths, okay, which were hired, and number of deaths. And obviously the people who die are the Sherpas, who make frequent trips, and it's still, so it's a risky business. Now the one thing that we didn't mention was, and it's, if you die on the mountain, it's very hard to bring the bodies back. And the one thing that needs to be mentioned here is that Indian climber whose body belongs to an Indo-Tibetan police expedition that took place in 1996, and here is only identified as wearing green mountaineering boots, and all the expeditions encountered the body curled up in the limestone, at about 27,000 feet. And finally, it was moved, okay, in 2014. Okay, so it's it's again, dying on the mountain is not exactly an easy way to get down from there. Okay, and and now this is the way I mentioned that I'll have a slide about the Kumbo ice fall. This is part of the glacier, which is at 18,000 feet, but it's a moving glacier of ice which is moving slowly at 3 to 4 feet per day, and there are various crevasses, and it's considered a death zone that it has been a part of. As many as 44 people have died since the expedition started, and uh, and in the last couple of years there had not been any deaths, but just sheer luck or something. And this is again, it's a difficult place because if there is somebody falls in the crevices, okay, or the rock falls on them, there is no easy way to land a helicopter over there. And one of the famous mountaineers, like the who is who of mountaineering, another was a Polish man named Jerry Kukuzaska. He fell in one of the crevices in 1989. So that sent shock waves through the mountaineering community. Okay. Again, now, here's the, like, what do you call a mountain climber who's afraid of heights? A cliffhanger. Okay. So again, you can just see how the ladders are laid out by the Sherpas, and it becomes a race, but they go climb during the night with a night lamp on their head, and put out ladders and ropes, okay, so that the paying customers and the climbers can start next morning, early morning. So again, they have to make allowances for returning, okay, and so, and this varieties of the sheer walls of ice made with sloping around. So the ropes have to be okay, and again, this is prone to avalanche and falling rocks, so that's hazardous. Now, this last but not the least, we need to go over some of the basic risks. There's the YouTube link is from a physician who has climbed herself, summited twice, named Dr. Emily Johnston, and has provided care for the mountaineers at base camp. And these are the main risks. The first of all is the high altitude pulmonary edema due to lack of oxygen, okay, and thin air. Your lungs fill up with water, a so-called pulmonary edema. At the same time, the same thing can happen to your brain, and when the brain is inside a skull, and obviously does not have much, the blood flow increases to the brain, does not have much place to expand, so you get herniation, and when it herniates to the spinal cord, that's almost fatal very quickly. And just even before you make your attempts at the base camp, the Westerners who do not have immunity are much more likely to catch diarrhea and infection. So gastrointestinal are very common due to lack of hygiene. Okay, and during any of climb, ice can fall on you, or you can fall in the ice. Okay, so that's another danger. Fall in the crevices, as we discussed above, and at the same time, coming down is equally harder because, as she mentions, going up is an option, coming down is not, because eventually you have to come down, and you have the catecholamine surge, and you're anxious, so you make mistakes at that time. And that time your memory is a little foggy, with lack of oxygen and exhaustion. And last but not the least, you can with UV radiation at that altitude, you can burn up your cornea and get snow blindness. Okay, and being blind on the mountain at 25,000 feet is not exactly, there's nobody going to be a lead. Coming down is hard enough for individual, so it's no, so that again, it's a case of death, literally. And 56% of deaths occurred during descent. Okay, and so her video it's a short clip in about 8 to 10 minutes, but it's worth watching because she clearly shows the equipment and this thing. And these are some of the oxygen cylinders that are, and this is monopoly of one of the Russian companies, and sometimes the quality control is less than ideal. So some of the valves have failed, and sometimes people have bought cheaper equipment, and with refilled by some Indian companies, and they have not worked very well. So cost cutting and buying good quality control becomes a big factor in who you sign up with. Okay, and again, we are loving the Mount Everest to death. You can see this is a whole line of people trying to go up the mountain during a very short climbing season, especially during May, that occurs. And this is an example of something called a Gamow bag, which is a hyperbaric bag. It's almost like a decompression chamber that is done for diving. This is similar, that the pressure can be inflated with air, increasing the so-called partial pressure of the hemoglobin dissociation. And this bag is pressurized with foot pump, and you can see that its pressure is raised up to 14 to 29 kilopascal. That is the unit in which it is measured. Okay, and that goes back to the early days of physics. Okay, and that just quickly simulates a lowering from high altitude to low altitude. So okay, and so the pressure can be increased. So that's a quick descent without actually descending. And this, is done under strict supervision of a physician, okay, or experienced climber. Okay, so that can be a lifesaver device. Okay, that is. And now this was the real mystery that caught the imagination of the mountain climbing in the early 20th century as to Mallory Irving, that expedition in 1924. Okay, when he was interviewed by one of the New York newspapers, his answer was, "Why climb mountains? Because it's there." So it was just, flipping off the mark, which made, zeitgeist. Okay, and the news started all out through the empire as to whether they had actually. And some photographs were taken from Camp 3 by other mountaineers, and wasn't quite clear whether they actually succeeded in summiting or not. And so it became like a big detective story. His axe was found in 1953, and finally his body was found in 1999, and it's still not clear, as to whether he had climbed or not. Okay, and this is, a mountain climber named Mark Sinot, actually did a searching for Irving's body, and the reason for that is because he was supposed to have carried a small box camera, and if the camera would have been the proof as to whether. So they found his body at a lower level, okay, but never found the camera type of thing. So again, so and so this is. And during some of this expedition, the Sherpas suffered the higher mortality. That the 7 Sherpas had died. But the telegram was that all the white people had survived. Okay, and so and the oxygen bottles were heavy type of thing, and so where his body was remained a mystery. Okay, for several decades. And so basically, some of these areas, one can say that is the graveyard of the third world, so to speak. Okay. And now on the American side, a businessman named Richard Bass, who was a ski resort owner from Utah and climbed various American mountains, South American mountains, Mount Elbrus, Mount Kilimanjaro, and has been successful in climbing 7 summits. Okay, is the tallest mountain on each continent. Okay, so you can just see that this is a feat beyond duplication, so you can just see how each tallest mountain in each area is climbed, and rightly around that time, the start of climbing started in the 90s. Okay, and so this is, people have run marathons on different continents, but this is a more unique or more challenging pursuit of climbing all the big mountains, and it takes resources to do that, obviously. Okay. Okay, and so there are varieties of records. So I think we're not going to get, it says the elevation, varieties of mountains. The first ascent about the Karakoram area in the range, and was in July of '54. Okay, and and this is about K2, by the way. And the cost for climbing is as much as 30,000. Okay, now it has gone up, obviously. Okay, and all of this relies on Sherpas, which is a small ethnic minority of Tibetan ancestry, so they're genetically protected, okay, from surviving able to low oxygen. And it's, again, the poverty is a big reason for signing up for this labor as porters. Okay, and now gradually, with better this thing, they have become entrepreneurs and started hoteling and agencies of their own through Nepal. Okay, but again, the working for the Westerners has ended up being sometimes a cause of very cultural conflict. And during some of the expeditions, the fight broke out between the Sherpas and the Western climbers, especially when some of the people lost their temper and addressed the Sherpas as with the F word, okay, and which is considered a big no-no in the Sherpa culture, insulting somebody's mother, and so that they came to blows, and some of the seasons were totally canceled in 2014, okay. And this was unfortunately followed by the earthquake that took place. And the salaries that are earned by the Sherpas are meager compared to the charges that are paid by the Western clients. Okay, they may make like $5,000 for a 3-month worth of hard, laborious work and multiple climbs. Okay, and not only men but also women. And somehow they have figured out that they can carry more than their own body weight, up to 150 pounds on their back. And and now the commercialization has become so crass that people are transporting espresso machines and televisions, okay, and and eggs and bacon breakfast up on the mountain hills, and the Sherpas are required to uh, transport all this equipment, okay, up, for to maintain the lifestyle. And one of the rock star Sherpa is, Babu Chhetri, has climbed on the summit 10 times, and he has established a record of in 24 hours, 1 hour surviving on without oxygen, and then one of the fastest climbs in 19 hours. And later on he's retired from his business and has become an entrepreneur and has founded varieties of schools. One of the sadnesses of human endeavor, of business endeavor, was a death of David Sharp. David Sharp was a climber, a British climber on his own, and was climbing on the cheap, so to speak, and ran out of, developed mountain sickness, and was sitting inside a cave, trying to get his wind back, and dozens of climbers walked right past him without offering to help. Okay, and this was a tragedy. Then eventually his body was found, frozen to death. Okay, in this area. Now this is not obviously his picture, but again shows the carelessness that and this and the crass commercialization that took place in this area. And this is a book written by investigative reporter named Michael Kodas, okay, about the high crimes in the Himalayas, and about the greed with increasing traffic and the sort of parasitic and predatory adventure, okay, and the people who went about 10, 15 years ago would not even recognize this area. So it tells about the criminal underworld on the slopes of mountains, and expeditions, that the stories of various climbers who died on Everest and was abandoned by his guide, named Niles Antazaga. He was an Argentinian climber, who signed up with a guide, and the guide was a shyster, and he abandoned him, at the mountain. And finally, his daughters went on an expedition to see what had really happened. And finally, the author's story of his, so it talks about his, the people did the investigative reporting on him, and they were the amateur climbers from Connecticut, okay, and showed the, the crass commercialization that had taken place between some Tibetans, and the climbing partners had taken place, So, and so the commercialization and other things, about the violence as to beating up other people, the climbers, for that, and stealing equipment, stealing oxygen from other tents, working on using other people's ropes, okay, and riding, becoming literally, taking the shortcut and cheating that has taken place. Now on the Chinese side, it's equally worse, that even though it is regulated, you can almost drive up to the base of mountain, and people have been reported as using drugs or stimulants, to get the pep and finish the climb faster. And at the same time, on the other side, some of the climbers have been on the other side have been even offered prostitution on that side. So the oldest profession has made their way even in the foothills of Everest. So this is a very harrowing and shocking story about about the commercialization and and the bad behavior that has permeated the climbing community. Okay. Now, well, moving on to the lesser or more genteel part, the Eastern Himalayas. The Eastern Himalayas are not as picturesque, but again, they are that kind of contention between China and India, and the tracing of that goes back to the British era in 1910 when Britain decided to negotiate with the border with the Tibetans, signed it without adequate input from the Chinese, who were their so-called masters, and the McMahon line was decided between the British India and Tibet, which eventually was taken over by Texas. Okay, and so this is again, and this was influence, and so the varieties of lines were drawn, but the Chinese decided, well, we did not participate in this, so they always rejected that particular line. And this line was not an interest; it was an arbitrary line because of the revenue territories from the non-revenue ones, because of the tea plantations were coming into force in this area. And so this was again, the British Empire decided to have a punitive expeditions were useful. So so they decided the purpose of this line to ensure that only British subjects went beyond this line with official permit. So this again became the big bone of contention between China and India as to what were the territories between the so-called Aborigines or mountain people who were a law unto themselves. They did not accept the control of neither the Chinese nor the Indians, and they're still the area of this part called Arunachal Pradesh. The Indian government is still fighting a lot of war of independence by the Naga kingdoms, and these were again incited by various Christian missionaries who have converted these headhunters of that region. Okay, and the varieties of conferences were held, and so it still becomes a big uh, headache for the government in New Delhi. Okay. And at the same time, when the Chinese decided to attack, they decided to claim this region and along with the border that front in the Kashmir era. So the okay, and we already talked about Hugh Fraser earlier, so I won't get into it. But he was the master, a polymath, geologist, botanist, physician, and was the so-called grandfather of the tea plantation in India. And later on, went back and was, forced to be reckoned with in the early days of tectonic theories. Okay, and became, from a creationist became, believer in Darwin's evolutionary theory. Okay, and Darjeeling is the city in Assam, the northwest frontier of a state of India, which is where the multiple tea plantations were originally owned by the British and the rich Bengalis, and now they are locally owned. And the women do the tea picking, and, and that is the and this showed up on the Jeopardy clue a month or so ago. 1959, the British tea planters started the European Club for this sport, and the answer is obviously polo. But the roots of polo dates back to the Hunza Valley of Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan, in a region between. So this was roots date down to Afghan game called Bushkazi, where the horse riders play with a dead carcass of a sheep. Okay, and this was the national sport of Afghanistan. To place the goat carcass in a goal. Okay, all right. And now this may surprise some of you, but the earliest discovery of oil was as early as 1825 in Assam Hills, and more former wells were dug in 1867, followed on the tail of Assam refinery in a place called Digboy, which is the oldest operating refinery, at least in Asia. Okay, and it relatively small production, and this was later on connected by railway, and then later on became a part of the Burma Shell oil explorations, Okay, and for completeness sake, in the same region, there is one of the highest monasteries that is there at 16,000 feet at the base of the Everest, and this is considered very sacred visiting for the Sherpas before they climb on the mountain. Okay. Now this map is important because it shows the two little small details of the traveling circuit that Michael Palin describes in his journey to the Himalayas. Now one is the Tiger Leaping Gorge, okay, which is in the Yunnan province of China, and the area called Lugu Lake, okay, which we'll talk about in details in the next slide. And this is the Lugu Lake area, is where a small mountain tribe, which are not Han Chinese by ethnicity, called Mosuo numbers. There are only about 40,000 people. They're really minuscule for considering China. And they have lived for centuries on the banks of this Lugu Lake, which I can show you here. This is right up here in the on the border in the mountainous region of Yunnan province, okay, of China, and Tibet, okay, and now Sichuan and Yunnan province, and now that is a matrilinear society that the women's rule, okay, and the women can participate in something called the walking marriages, when they can have more than one husband and have as many lovers that they choose, okay, and the children are looked after by their brothers and their fathers in the same way, so it goes on, and and they're very strong, powerful women. You can see that they're, so it's one of the few matrilinear societies. There's a Kingdom of Women. This is a link from the BBC, fairly recent, to okay. So that may be of interest to some of you, okay. And this is the famous the myth is that a tiger leaped over the gorge, in one of the branches of the Yangtze River, okay, and so this is close to a city called Linjuang in China, okay, and so that the Chinese government has made a tourist attraction. You can see that now whether and the gorge is quite deep, and obviously it's not a kayakable area, although some enterprising people have actually tried kayaking this, and this is close to the so-called city of Shangri-La that they have created in the same area, okay, for a tourist attraction. Okay, and now here's the great Michael Palin, which got me started on this idea that the Chinese government from Tibet had built something called the Friendship Bridge, and this was obviously before the earthquake. So the Friendship Highway started from the Kathmandu and traverses the bridge, which is and it crosses into Nepal and goes all the way to Shigatse, which is the second largest city in Tibet, which is where the Panchen Lama, the number 2 Lama, resides. It covers about 900 kilometers, so about 500 miles or so. Okay, and there was a dam. It was originally completed in 1962 and was rebuilt in 2019. So this is this is an older video. So this is the older bridge, and this is the newer area that was rebuilt by the Chinese government. And a crossing is about a few hundred people cross, and they have to cross by foot. Okay, and because the side of driving is between the left and the right side, they have to switch buses. Okay, when they go across, so it won't. Now this is some of the risque temple carvings in the Pashupatinath temple in Bhaktapur, which is the second biggest city in Nepal. Okay, and these were created during the Malla dynasty before the modern Nepal came into existence. So one should say 14th or 15th century. And this depicts the sex as the normal part of human behavior and part of the so-called tantric or Kali worship literature. So it shows sexual acts in various graphic manners, very artistic, obviously. But again, it was really shocking to the prudent Victorian eyes. You can see anything goes, so to speak. So, but these are high up on near the roof of the temples. So, but depicts sex as a part of normal human, pursuit. Okay, and now again, the future of this area is still very controversial because of the climate change and disappearing glaciers, mudslides, pollution, and obviously with this huge number of people, they have to even carry out their night soil from the Everest mountain. But for weird reason, the Sherpas don't have to do that because they are part of that uh, uh, region, so to speak. And the various dams may be contributing indirectly to earthquakes. Okay, then the Sherpas have a higher mortality, less now, but still, and the large number of we're loving Everest to death. And there is always this possibility of wars between two nuclear powers, India, China, Pakistan, and so on and so forth. Okay, and these are the varieties of huge dams that are being built. Okay, and there have been protests for these dams. You can see, hopefully this will play. No, I guess it not. I think my video did not, get downloaded or did not link properly. Okay, this was just, like a small video of the protest. I know the red rock monks kneeling on dusty road, showing thumbs up of begging for mercy. So that protests are, much more peaceful and this thing. But again, and this is seen inside some of the monasteries. Okay, and again, the China is muscling into the contested border. As you can see, they are deliberately sending population and building villages and into the disputed region on the Nepal-Bhutan borders. Okay, and this were some of the investigative reporting done from BBC. Inside territory claimed by Bhutan. So 16 a border claimed by India. So again, so they are muscling into the area vigorously. Okay, and again, the first secure the villages. It's like the people, occupation, becomes possession, so to speak. So there's this. Okay, and these are some of the satellite photos, that are taking place of the heavy things inside the territory border claimed by India. Okay, how? And these are varieties of books. I already had given the ideas of the two books that we earlier talked about by John Kay about Himalayas, Ed Douglas as the Human History of the Himalayas. Okay, and this is ex British Army veteran, walking the Himalayas. He's he had walked not just around the Himalayas, but he had walked the Arabian Peninsula, he had walked the Americas. Okay, and he's a well-known writer who's a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society, guy named Levinson, and he started out from in the Pakistan border and had walked all the way to the Tibet, And the other thing is the physician experience, hand surgeon who was part of the disastrous expedition. He has written a book, called Doctor on the Himalayas, and then Next Everest, again about, and this is an interesting book about a young man who had bipolar disorder growing up in Seattle, but somewhere along the line fall in love with rock climbing and had interest in photography and went on to be successful photographer for National Geographic magazine. Okay, so has climbed Everest as well. Okay. So I think we are finished, and I will stop the recording and share this with people. Okay, it was fun doing it, and hopefully I'll see some of you next time when we talked about Hiroshima and the current nuclear strategies. So